Hey, thank you for joining the Reading Reaction Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Knudsen. On today's episode, we will cover this past weekend in college football. And I don't know about you, we usually start with the Gators here, but I really enjoyed the bye week. We could have, this is well-timed, a well-timed bye week after an extremely frustrating loss to LSU. Regroup, get ready for Georgia. Let's see how it comes out. Did not hear the news on Grantham this week, so the man's sticking around. He'll be there for the Georgia game, it sounds like. Frustrating. The change needs to be made. It needs to be made, but it seems like Dan Mullen's going to wait at least another week to make that move. So we'll see how it goes against Georgia, but we'll turn over a leaf from that LSU game. Let's look at Anthony Richardson. Hopefully gets the opportunity to start this week. And, we'll see what that Gators offense can do against the Bulldogs defense. We'll do a preview episode of Stand Up and Holler, releasing it on Wednesday for everyone. We wanted to do it closer to kickoff this week. So rather than do our usual Sunday night, we'll be releasing it on Wednesday. Look for that on the Reading Reaction YouTube channel. All right, let's dive into the games. SEC play. Tennessee goes to Tuscaloosa to face the Alabama Crimson Tide. Hey, back to the third Saturday in October. Same old result, though. Totally different feel for the game, though. The last several years just been blowout after blowout in favor of Alabama, but a field goal with under 10 minutes left in the third quarter. It cut the Bama lead to 21-17. Tennessee was sticking around. The highlights were interesting. You kind of checked in on the game a few times as you were flipping around. But 5 straight touchdowns, or 5 straight scoring drives, I should say, 4 touchdowns and 1 field goal. They put the Tide over the top, 52-24. Bryce Young, 31-43 in this one, 371 yards through the air, 2 interceptions. Brian Robinson had 3 touchdowns on the ground on 107 yards rushing. Tennessee, couple big plays from Hendon Hooker, big passes, 57 yards and 70 yards for TDs. It's progress. I know this is not the type of result you'll want to see if you're a Vols fan, but you're starting to look remotely competitive in some instances. They just don't have the roster to keep it down the stretch against a top-tier team like Alabama. But Tennessee and Heupel got to get some excitement from this season. If you're a Tennessee Vols fan, it's been a rough few years here, and what Heupel's done under the circumstances with what she was presented at the beginning of the year, I think he's done a great job so far at Tennessee. Maybe not in terms of the win-loss record, but in terms of this team competing week in and week out, he's doing a good job, and you haven't seen that in the last several years with Tennessee football. Alabama, on the other hand, everyone wants to talk about Georgia. We know about Georgia. We know Georgia's very good. Everyone knows about Alabama, too. We know they're very good. I'm not betting against Saban still at this point. I don't care how Georgia's good, how good Georgia looks. I'm not betting against Saban. It's just good rule of thumb to follow over the last decade here. Georgia will get their first big test against a for-real offense against Florida this week. We'll see how that goes. That could give us a look into what a more complete team like Alabama could do against Georgia. We haven't seen that. What's Georgia's toughest game on their schedule so far? Clemson, who's struggling. Their offense has not looked great. We saw them go up against Pitt. I was very interested. We'll get to that Clemson-Pitt game in a minute, but I was very interested to see how that Clemson offense would do against Pitt, to see maybe it's been an early season slog for that offense. But no, Pitt did the exact same thing. Pitt shut that offense down just like they were shut down against Georgia. So, hey, Clemson's offense really struggling. Seen it in multiple games, even through some Clemson wins this year. You've seen that offense struggle. So Georgia, a nice win over Clemson at the beginning of the season, but can you say they've seen a truly elite offense or a truly elite team? Arkansas, certainly a good team, not elite. Kentucky, good, not elite. So Florida, elite offense, not so elite defense. So it'll be interesting to see the matchup there with Georgia and how that could potentially be spun to project against how they would do against Alabama later on in a potential SEC championship game matchup. If Alabama trips up, though, the Ole Miss Rebels are staying right on their heels with the 31-17 win over LSU. And, folks, it wasn't even that close. Eli Manning Day down in Oxford. How convenient. Arch Manning in the house for a recruiting visit, and it's Eli Manning Day, and the end zone say Manning? Good job, Lane Kiffin. That's a well-planned recruiting visit right there. LSU comes out of the gate in this one with a 9-play, 90-yard touchdown drive to go up 7-0. but the Tigers, they could not find that magic they had against the Gators last week, and they gave up 31 consecutive points. This Ole Miss team really buried them, put them away. And I know a lot of Florida fans were probably watching this LSU team to see if they're going to follow up on what they did against Florida last week. And as suspected, they just could not do it at all. So if Ole Miss, they can keep this pressure up on Bama, they could find themselves in Atlanta if Bama slips up, maybe an upset against Auburn or something along down the road. It's possible. It's not possible here, but Ole Miss has to keep winning to keep the pressure on the Tide. Next up for the Rebs, a trip to Auburn. So tough game for Ole Miss in and of itself. Auburn's been playing some decent football this year. South Carolina went down to Texas A&M, and it was just sheer dominance by the Aggies in College Station. They beat Carolina 44-14. Texas A&M, they bursted out of the gates, take a 41-0 lead by the end of the third quarter. Jimbo Fisher's defense forces 3 turnovers. They held the Gamecocks to under 200 yards of total offense on the night. Wasn't even close. Mississippi State, another blowout here, goes up to Nashville, beats up on Vandy 45-6, 522 total yards of offense, 461 through the air. Never a doubt for Mike Leach and the Bulldogs against Vandy on Saturday night. Biggest highlight may have been Mike Leach's post-game interview, ranting about his disdain for candy corn and which candies are good, and you got to have this type of gummy bear, not that type. It's worth it. If you like stupid Mike Leach rants, have at that one post-game interview. Arkansas 45, Arkansas Pine Bluff 3. Worth mentioning in this one, the game itself doesn't matter too much to the average SEC fan, but 6 first-half touchdowns for Arkansas and a field goal allow the Razorbacks to sit on a 45-0 lead and just coast till the end of the game. Mississippi State and LSU next for the Razorbacks. Looking ahead to this weekend, Florida, Georgia, of course, big one in Jacksonville. Ole Miss at Auburn. I believe that was a 7 p.m. Eastern kickoff. Kentucky at Miss State. Mizzou at Vandy. Other games of note there. All right, let's go to the ACC. Wake Forest, the Demon Deacons 70, Army 56. Wake Forest, they keep its perfect record intact, but their trip to West Point was anything but dominating despite putting up 70 points on the board. 638 yards of offense. Awesome on offense, but Army ran all over Wake Forest, racking up 416 rushing yards on 70 attempts, scoring 56 points, like I mentioned. The Black Knights, they really kept pace with Wake Forest here. It wasn't until the third quarter where on a 4th and 5, Wake Forest, there were Armies on the Wake Forest 28-yard line. Wake Forest forces Army into a passing situation. Obviously, a team that runs the ball 70 times by choice, does not love to pass, ends up throwing a ball out to the flat. Trevion Reed jumps the route. He returns the interception 83 yards to the house to give Wake Forest some breathing room, 2-touchdown lead. And that was all Wake Forest needed on the day because the offense was cooking. Undefeated Wake Forest, they face Duke this week. And although Wake will make it into November, very likely unscathed, a tough slate awaits. So they will be tested before the ACC title game. At North Carolina, who despite some ugly losses, some weird losses for North Carolina this year, for a team that was projected a top 10 preseason team, they've lost some funky games this year for the Tar Heels have. But still, it's going to be a tough test for Wake. I don't think a lot of people thought UNC would have an issue with Wake at the beginning of the year. UNC next week, NC State the following week, at Clemson, despite their woes, still a tough roster, and at Boston College to finish things off. So 3 tough road games plus NC State at home for Wake Forest to finish off ACC play before the ACC title game. But we're getting to a point where it's unlikely, even though it is unlikely, I think the Demon Deacons make it through unbeaten to the ACC title game. Clemson and NC State going down this past weekend had a huge effect on the ACC race, and the Demon Deacons, they may be able to lose one regular season game and win out and still make a case for the playoffs. So if they can maybe drop to North Carolina, win the rest of their games, beat Pitt in the ACC title game, one loss Wake Forest, they're at least up there talking about it. So a pretty crazy world we're living in right now where Wake Forest could be legitimately in the playoff race till the end, but we'll see if they can follow through on that tough slate. Let's go on to Pittsburgh. I mentioned them a couple of times. Pitt 27, Clemson 17. Pitt had a chance to prove itself, and they got it done. It's nice to see a team that's on the rise a little bit actually follow through. Of course, they have that stupid loss to Western Michigan on their resume still. So that's really what's keeping them from being a top 10 team here. But the number 23 Panthers, they're tested. They were favored in this game. People expected them to win against a struggling Clemson team, and they got the job done impressively, too. It wasn't just a lucky game. Kenny Pickett went 25 of 39 for 302 yards. 2 touchdowns on the day, a couple of nice passes he had there, one before halftime, especially nice little play that got open. But Clemson continued to struggle on offense. I saw DJ Uiagalelei, he ends up getting benched in this one. He only completed 12 passes, 128 yards, no touchdowns, 2 interceptions. And like I said, at one point he goes to the bench. However, he's under constant pressure. That O-line's not blocking anything. And I saw one play in particular, he had a guy wide open, the running back wide open down the middle of the field, hit him on it was a perfect pass. He was in stride. If the running back catches it, he's gone. He had a great matchup. He had about 2 or 3 yards on this guy. Perfect pass from DJ, and the running back drops it. Clemson ends up punting. Pitt scores on the next drive to take the lead. So that's just how the season's gone for this Clemson team. But I'm sorry, I don't feel sorry for I don't feel sorry for the Tigers this season. You've had a nice run the last decade, Clemson. You can eat it like the rest of us right now. Clemson, despite their issues, this is still a signature win here for Pitt and Pat Narduzzi. So this is a good time to be a Pitt Panther because you head into the ACC race here. You got a 2-game edge in the Coastal Division. Seemed to be a lock for the ACC title game, at least the appearance. And should Pitt win out, we could see the Panthers creep into that playoff conversation despite like that stupid loss to Western Michigan, which ultimately will likely cost them. Not used to having the idea of Pitt just running the table either. So you got to get the job done, but we're getting deeper into the season, and Pitt is set up nicely going into the second half of this season. Miami, NC State, the Hurricanes escape with a 31-30 victory over the Wolfpack. And after 2 close ACC losses, it's about time Miami catches a break. I don't feel sorry for the Canes too often, but they needed this one. They win a tight game to improve to 3-4 on the season. And Hurricanes quarterback Tyler Van Dyke, he threw for 325 yards, 4 touchdowns. Oklahoma transfer wide receiver Charleston Rambo, It was his favorite target on the day. He ends up catching 9 balls for 127 yards, and 2 of those were touchdowns. Van Dyke looked impressive. You go back and watch those highlights. He's crisp on some of those downfield throws. I really liked what I saw from him. NC State, on the other hand, they drop a winnable game that would have kept them in the hunt as a long shot for the playoffs. But it's only their first loss in the ACC, so the Wolfpack, even though this loss will hurt, they're still in control of their own destiny in terms of making it to the ACC championship game, but there's no room for error. You got that win against Clemson under your belt. You got Wake Forest coming up in a few weeks. You can't slip up anymore. Versus Louisville and at Florida State the next 2 weeks for NC State. Speaking of those Seminoles, FSU 59, UMass 3. And Mike Norvell after the game, he said, today we did what we needed to do. We went out and we were dominant in a football game. That hasn't been said a whole lot this year. Norvell continued, it's been a while since we've been able to showcase that identity that we are capable of. Even when people expect you to do that, can you still show up and go out and can you still show up and go get the job done? Previous answer with this program, losing to Jacksonville State in September, no, it was not the case. But FSU, they end up doing a lot of damage on the offensive side of the ball. Most of it on the ground, 365 yards on 45 carries with sophomore Jashawn Corbin leading the way with 127 yards gained and 1 touchdown, only 11 attempts too. So he was really breaking out away every time he got the ball pretty much. 3rd win in a row for the Noles. And again, it's UMass. I'm not getting carried away about the opponents here, although it was a nice win on the road against North Carolina last week, but pretty okay to weak schedule they've been feasting on here for these 3 wins. Syracuse, at North Carolina, now UMass. But great opportunity for Mike Norvell to make a serious statement in the next few weeks with a trip to Clemson, a home date against FSU's nemesis in the ACC. It seems like NC State always gives the Noles problems, no matter what the records are, in a rivalry game at home against Miami. So I think with FSU, with the situation that they've been through in the last couple of years, just winning at all is a good thing. It's a positive step in the direction for them. You like to see whether or not they could follow up and build on that momentum over the next month here. Looking ahead to this weekend in the ACC, Duke goes to Wake Forest. Like I mentioned, Miami at Pitt, FSU at Clemson, North Carolina at Notre Dame, Tech at Georgia Tech, BC at Syracuse, Louisville at NC State, Virginia at BYU. All right, on to the Big Ten. Illinois 20, Penn State 18, and 9 overtimes. Yep, you read that right. 9 overtimes to settle this putrid offensive display. Penn State struggled throughout the day, 82 yards on the ground, 165 through the air. I wasn't sold on this Penn State team as a top 10 team. I have not been sold on that. I thought they were going to get exposed next week against Ohio State, though. Illinois, they end up rushing for 357 yards, which is great, but they only threw for 38 on 8 completions. So Penn State knew it was coming. They still couldn't stop it for the most part. But this one goes into overtime, triple overtime, the new rules. You have to go for 2-point conversions every time. There's no drives. You just go for 2. So it's single play, back and forth. They were switching. They'd run 2 plays, go the opposite end of the field, run 2 plays, opposite end of the field. So it's not the most fluid system. Maybe you just stick with one side of the field, for example. I'm not a fan of it. It just feels weird for a football game to come down to what penalty kicks are in soccer. You watch a World Cup game and it's hard fought, and then they just line up and kick penalty kicks to decide the match. I always hate that. It just feels wrong. It doesn't feel right. And, this is the longest overtime game in college football history. I think the previous was the 7 OT one that was it A&M and LSU that played? I didn't check that before I got in here. Sorry about that. But I think A&M and LSU, that 74-72 was like 7 overtimes, right? How often do we see those games, though? Why was this even regulated? Like, what are we doing? How often are we really going over 2 overtimes? That didn't happen much. I don't know. Just think it's a weird rule. Not a huge fan of it. Ended up being kind of entertaining because neither one of these teams could convert the first several overtimes. And then when Illinois finally converts, Penn State does, or Penn State converts, Illinois converts. There's a couple times when they converted where you're like, okay, they're getting this thing here. But then Illinois converts, Penn State doesn't, game over. Both teams, the OT in general was a struggle. Ends up being an interesting way to play out that rule. But the Illini walk out of Happy Valley with a 9 overtime victory over the Penn State Nittany Lions in a game that no one expected to be nearly as close as it was. Penn State's next opponent here, the Ohio State Buckeyes, pure dominance, plain and simple, at Indiana in Bloomington on Saturday night. 6 first half TDs put the Bucks up early, in OSU, they just cruised to the finish line, winning 54-7, playing 3 quarterbacks on the night. The Buckeyes, who need to run the table to get into the playoffs, begin a critical stretch of games next week at home against Penn State, at Nebraska versus Purdue, versus Michigan State, and at Michigan to close out the regular season for OSU. Northwestern, Michigan, the Wolverines. These are the types of games that Michigan has been dropping the last few years, where the disappointing seasons they've had with Harbaugh, they'll lose to a tough team like Northwestern. Northwestern is a very competitive group of players, not the most talented team, but they're always competitive under Pat Fitzgerald. Just a tough team week in and week out. Michigan ends up getting a 33-7 victory in this one, but it was a hard-fought first half. It was 10-7 at halftime. Both teams, they were going back and forth. It was a slugfest. Did not carry over into the second half, though, and the Wolverines run away with this one, 33-7. The Wolverines' ground game tallied just shy of 300 yards, with both Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins eclipsing the 100-yard mark on the day. The pair also scored a combined total of 4 touchdowns to lead Michigan to a 7-0 mark, heading into a massive matchup with unbeaten in-state rival Michigan State next weekend in East Lansing. Michigan State had the weekend off, so they'll be undefeated too. So big matchup in East Lansing. That's going to be on the noon game on Fox next weekend. Wisconsin 30, Purdue 13. Can Purdue follow up after a trip to Iowa? Nope. Nope, not even close. A week after throwing the ball all over the yard against the number 2 Hawkeyes, the Boilermakers barely gained 200 yards in this one. They turned the ball over 5 times against a ferocious Wisconsin defense, and I believe they rushed for minus 13 yards on the day. Despite the stellar defensive performance, though, the Badgers, they kept the ball on the ground for the most part. On the offensive side, quarterback Graham Mertz, he's dealing with a rib injury. He only threw 8 passes on the day, 5 of them completed for 52 total yards, no touchdowns through the air. Mertz, his rib injury is something to watch. This Badgers team, that you know what they're going to be the next few weeks here. They're just going to run the ball, play defense, solid, good old Wisconsin football, and we'll see if the Badgers can carry their way in that way into the Big Ten, take that style of play and carry into the Big Ten title game as Big Ten West champions, because Wisconsin is still in full control over what they do in the Big Ten West. If they win out, like I said, they take the West, but they got Iowa up next, and it's going to be a tough chore for them next week, despite that Iowa loss to Purdue. Maryland goes up to Minneapolis. The Gophers, no issue. 326 yards on the ground for the Gophers in this one. Minnesota picks up a Big Ten victory to stay alive in the race in the West. And looking ahead to next week, I mentioned the Michigan State game, massive game in that up there. That'll really start separating in the East between the Ohio State-Penn State game and the Michigan State. We'll see who the top 2 teams are the East coming out of next week. Not happy with the Big Ten scheduling department this week. Iowa, Wisconsin, you're sticking it at noon, even though there's plenty of room in that 3:30 time slot. You also got Rutgers, Illinois, Indiana, Maryland, Minnesota, Northwestern, and Purdue at Nebraska, leading into the night matchup, 7:30 ABC, Penn State at Ohio State for that Big Ten nightcap. Gotta spread some of those good games out if you're the Big Ten, though. I have no idea what they're doing. On to the Big 12. The least impressive undefeated team in the country this year is the Oklahoma Sooners, 35-23 over Kansas. Once again, Oklahoma they just keep finding ways to survive. And at some point, you can talk trash about them not being a great team, or you could stop and say, or they're finding ways to get things done. I'm going to stay on the side of they're not a great team until I see a little more. I thought they were hitting their stride. I really did. I was starting to think that this was a team that took some time to find itself. Lincoln Riley makes the gutsy move to move on from Spencer Rattler, who was projected maybe as a Heisman favorite. This was the year Oklahoma's loaded with talent. Maybe Alabama would be a little down, potentially replacing so much. Like maybe Oklahoma, this is the year to make a run. That was all the preseason talk. Instead, by the Texas game, Rattler's bench for Caleb Williams. Williams comes in. He leads them back against Texas. Big win last week for Okie State. And then they go into Kansas. And just to illustrate how bad Kansas has been this year, even though Lance Leipold coming over from Buffalo, great hire for the Jayhawks, I think he's going to get that program going again. But the Jayhawks were 1-5 entering into this game. Their lone win this season was sweating out a 17-14 win over FCS South Dakota State. And Kansas's close loss the rest of the season here, heading into Saturday night, was a 19-point defeat at the hands of Duke. They're getting slaughtered. Texas Tech's killing them. Baylor, no matter who they're stepping on the field with, it's just not even close. But despite a terrible start to the season, the Sooners were down to the Jayhawks 10-0 at halftime. Kansas used a series of long drives to really keep the ball out of Oklahoma's hands. They held it for over 20 of the 30 first half minutes. But OU, they turn on the Jets in the second half after sleepwalking through the first half. They score 5 touchdowns in 5 possessions, although it wasn't always easy at times. Kansas, they managed to score a couple TDs in the second half as well. They stuck around and arguably stopped Oklahoma on a critical 4th down due to forward progress, but a heads-up play by Caleb Williams saved the day for the Sooners. For those of you who watched the game like me at noon, this was the one I keyed in on in the second half. With OU leading 28-23, it's 4th and 1 from the Sooners' 46-yard line. Running back Kennedy Brooks was clearly stopped short of the first down line, but he was stood up by some Jayhawk defenders. He wasn't going to get the first down. Caleb Williams, the quarterback, comes out of nowhere, swoops in, grabs the ball out of his hands, out of the running back's hands, and shocked everyone by scrambling forward for a first down. really never seen a play like it. It was really intense. He just walked in there, grabbed it, and the defenders were focused on the running back, so he kind of slipped right by everybody. Should it have been called a forward progress? I say yes. You will never get an Oklahoma fan to admit that, but I think the Jayhawks fans, they have something to complain about with that one. I thought that was a rough call for Kansas. So Oklahoma ended up going down scoring on that drive. They go up 35-23, and they were able to put the game away. Oklahoma remains undefeated and unimpressive. These types of performances will eventually bite this team, but it's like I said, at some point you got to look at the close wins and go, hey, maybe this is like a team of destiny situation where they're just finding ways to win and stick around. And we're going to look up at the end of the season and be like, hey, it's ugly, but there's still a 0 in the loss column. Texas Tech is next for Oklahoma. They finish with Baylor, Iowa State, and Okie State, and then the Big 12 title game as well. Who will they face in that Big 12 title game? Well, Iowa State said we're not eliminated yet this week. They hung tough on the home field against Oklahoma State, 24-21 victory for the Cyclones. I said it last week that if Oklahoma State can survive their trip to Ames, it would be time to start taking the Cowboys seriously in terms of a playoff contender. They did not. Oklahoma State, they've made runs like this in the season before, and then they always seem to drop off somewhere. They'll probably end up losing 2 more games down the road. It's just kind of what they do with Gundy. They're good teams. They're very competitive. It's a program that has money in it. Like they know what they're doing to put on a competitive product at Oklahoma State. They just can't quite get over the hump. It's they're a little cursed in a way. I don't know. We maybe start talking curse at Oklahoma State. They just don't seem to catch the breaks. 2 missed field goals by Okie State end up being the difference in this tightly fought game. Cyclones quarterback Brock Purdy did play fantastic, though. Absolutely lights out, going 27 of 33, 307 yards for 2 touchdowns. Breece Hall, the running back for the Cyclones, he had his 70 yards on the ground along with another touchdown. And Iowa State gets a go-ahead score, 24-21 with about 5 minutes remaining in the game, I believe. And I'll tell you what, Matt Campbell, Iowa State, you can't count them out. I know they had the disappointing losses against Iowa and Baylor to start. And this Big 12 race, it just keeps staying interesting. You got Iowa State, Baylor, Okie State, Oklahoma. Everybody just kind of mixed in up at the top there. And OU is sitting pretty at the top overall, but it's a competitive race in the Big 12 this year. Very, very deep conference in terms of, I think Oklahoma's the clear-cut number 1, but that 2 through 6 is pretty even down the line. Kansas State escapes Texas Tech 25-24. And surprising news on Monday night here, the loss drops the Red Raiders to 5-3, but it puts an end to the Matt Wells era in Lubbock. Last year it was talked about that the former Utah State coach was in trouble. He made some staff changes, I believe, at Texas Tech. Doesn't get through. He gets through 8 games and he gets fired. So, hey, look at that. You can make a midseason change when you're not happy with your coach. That's something that Dan Mullen should consider for his defensive coordinator. I don't know. But Texas Tech, what's the expectation there? 5-3. That's not bad, right? Texas, are we having Big 12 title expectations out there in Lubbock right now? You haven't been close of late. And maybe that's the frustration, is that it just hasn't been close of late. Of course, a couple of years ago, they move on from Cliff Kingsbury, and he gets a promotion into the NFL with the Arizona Cardinals. But Matt Wells was the replacement for Kingsbury coming in here. And I don't know. I'm not sure what Texas Tech is after, because even with Mike Leach, there's a lot of seasons where they're around that 5-3 mark. That seems about right for Texas Tech. So we'll see what they end up doing. Early names I've kind of been reading about are Graham Harrell and Sonny Dykes is a potential. Of course, Spike Dykes was the longtime coach there. Sonny Dykes got a great thing going over at SMU right now. Let's see what direction they end up going at Texas Tech. Pac-12 football. Oregon escapes the Rose Bowl, 34-31 over UCLA. Oregon, they face their old head coach with Chip Kelly. Shootout ends up ensuing. I don't think that's a total surprise. The Ducks, the Bruins, they both end up gaining over 350 yards. UCLA, they took a 17-14 lead into the locker room, but the Ducks responded with 3 touchdowns and 4 drives to open the third quarter to take a 34-17 lead UCLA used 2 interceptions late to cut the lead to 34-31. The Bruins had one final shot to take the lead after 2 first downs from Dorian Thompson-Robinson, had UCLA set up in Oregon territory, but Thompson-Robinson ends up getting hurt. Makes way for Ethan Garbers to come in the game, backup quarterback for UCLA. He ends up throwing an interception. Bruins fall. Tough loss. Hey, Chip Kelly's doing good things with this UCLA program. They're awfully competitive this year, but once again, they're on the wrong end of a close result. Oregon keeps their playoff hopes alive. Ducks 34-31. Notre Dame, traditional rivalry game here, 31, USC 16. Kyron Williams rushes for 138 yards and 2 touchdowns as Notre Dame sprinted out to a 24-3 lead before USC tacked on 2 late scores that were rather meaningless. 3 and 4 for the Trojans for the season, whereas the Irish improved to 6-1. North Carolina, Navy, Virginia, Georgia Tech, Stanford. All those are the remaining games. You scared of those games if you're a Notre Dame fan? Probably not. They should be favored in every single one of them down the stretch. And I'll be honest, I wrote Notre Dame off as a playoff contender with the loss of Cincinnati at home. But if the Fighting Irish, if they end up finishing the season without another hiccup and their lone loss is a playoff-bound Cincinnati team that may end up even taking the top spot if Georgia were to slip up, you'd have to say that blemish looks a lot better on their resume than originally it might have. So I don't know. This Irish team, I do a playoff tracker for Read and Reaction every week, and there's some teams I took the liberty of maybe moving on from, not thinking that I'd have to bring them back up, but I might be adding Notre Dame back into that playoff tracker along with a couple other schools that are catching my attention this week. Utah falls to Oregon State, and no one wants to take control over the Pac-12 South. This is a part of the division. This is division in the Pac-12. Everyone, UCLA has it. They end up seeding it to Arizona State, who then seeds it to Utah. And Utah's like, we're not interested either. Oregon State, we can't handle a trip to Corvallis. The Utes fall on a trip up there. The Beavers, though, they're not a pushover anymore. This is a dangerous team, and they use a balanced attack to put up 42 points and keep their hopes alive in the Pac-12 North. They're on the heels of Oregon, and they end up keeping that one loss in the Pac-12 column there. They could potentially steal the North from Oregon. We'll see how that goes. Washington State in the battle of the Cougars with BYU here. Washington State, they end up failing with a 2-point conversion late in the game. 21-19 BYU. BYU, they squashed the last 4 minutes of the clock in this one. Impressive way to put away a game here. Good road win in Pullman. Good fight from a Washington State team that lost their coach at midseason here. Nick Rolovich, of course, out, was fired due to not fulfilling the vaccine mandate for Washington State staff and students. Big story up there. He's talking lawsuit too, so that thing could get ugly up in Pullman. We'll see how that goes. Looking ahead to next weekend for the Pac-12, Colorado at Oregon, Washington State at Arizona State, Oregon State at Cal, Arizona at USC, UCLA at Utah, Washington at Stanford. Group of 5, a couple of interesting games this weekend. Few of them, actually. We're adding to the Group of 5 slate here. Coastal Carolina falls. That has not happened since November 23rd, 2019 in the regular season. Of course, they lost their bowl game last year to Liberty, but regular season, first time since November 23rd, 2019, Coastal Carolina has lost a football game. And App State, not exactly the chippy underdog in the Sun Belt. I mean, this App State team, they've been a hell of a program. They outgained Coastal Carolina by over 200 yards, but the Mountaineers, they still, on their own home field, they still needed a last-second field goal to take down Coastal Carolina. So tough loss for the Chanticleers. You can kiss whatever outside hopes of a playoff shot. Like everyone gets 2 losses, and maybe we're in the discussion. Bye-bye, but no more undefeated Coastal Carolina. First time in a couple of years we're able to say that. Tulane goes into SMU and just gets waxed 55-26. SMU quiet 7-0 on the season. Another big win for them too. A relatively weak slate, though, outside of the TCU win on the road, has kept the Ponies out of the national limelight. But games with Memphis, UCF, who have been the powers in the AAC the last several years, and now Cincinnati, and at Cincinnati could potentially vault the Mustangs into playoff contention. Think about it. If they go undefeated and they beat Cincinnati, why wouldn't they replace Cincinnati in that conversation? Feels like this is a ways away, though. So I'm gonna hold off on the SMU hype train, but keep an eye on SMU going forward. Could be interesting. Colorado State falls 26-24 to Utah State. Nick, why are you telling me about this game? Like, Utah State, Colorado State. It's not a massive game here, but it's worth checking out the end of this game if you missed it. So Colorado State has no timeouts. They end up driving nearly the length of the field to get an opportunity at 42-yard field goal with 11 seconds on the clock, but the clock starts running. They got a first down. They could have spiked the ball and taken their time getting on the field, but instead the receiver catches it. The whole offense sprints off. The field goal team sprints on. Nobody clocks the ball. So instead of taking their time with the field goal, clocking the ball, taking their time, they end up on first down, rushing through the play and missing a 42-yard field goal. So Steve Adazio, Urban Meyer assisted, not great special teams play going on out there at Colorado State. I was reading an article where I think they gave up 4 touchdowns in 6 games on special teams, or 6 and 4 or something like that. So it was, they last year in 2020, they've not had great special teams play out at Colorado State. So check that out if you had not seen that clip yet. On Saturday, Cincinnati, we saw the Bearcats. It looked uglier than it actually was. I feel like it's something where you look at this Navy game. Cincinnati ends up getting a 7-point win, 27-20. And on the surface, if you flipped in, it was tied at one point in around halftime, and the Bearcats, they were pretty much underwhelming on the day. I think's the word for it. They didn't really blow you away or impress you, but they did manage to build a 27-10 lead before giving up 2 late scores to create a final of 27-20. So it looked closer than it actually was in this one. Cincinnati was in control most of the day here against Navy. At Tulane versus Tulsa, at USF versus SMU, at ECU remain for the Bearcats. So 5 games away from Cincinnati, talking about an undefeated regular season here. San Diego State, another team we're going to start keeping an eye on, unbeaten still in the Mountain West, 20-14 over Air Force. The Aztecs are now 7-0. This is a stout defensive team, not a lot of offense though. So their games are not the most fun to watch, but they play good football at San Diego State. I don't believe they have the strength of schedule to warrant any real conversation about the playoffs down the road. So whether or not they go undefeated may not matter, but they're just another group of 5 team to keep your eye on. University of Texas, San Antonio, UTSA, 45, Louisiana Tech 16. We saw this UTSA team upset Illinois earlier in the year on the road, and a dominant fourth quarter in this one put the game away. UTSA improves to 8-0 with the win over Louisiana Tech. Same situation here at San Diego State. The strength of schedule, it's just not there to warrant real playoff consideration, but they're not a real threat, but just another team to keep an eye on as an unbeaten G5 member. At UTEP versus Southern Miss versus UAB, and at North Texas remain for the UTSA Roadrunners. Well, that's This Week in Review. I'm your host, Nick Knudsen. Thank you again for joining this quick episode of the Read and Reaction podcast. We got Stand Up and Holler coming this week. I'm chasing an interview with a Georgia writer. It hasn't come through officially. And I mentioned this last week on my podcast. Just want to apologize to anyone who was expecting it and didn't get it. But Kevin Kelly interview from last year that I did about the coach who never punts. He's with Presbyterian College. I interviewed him while he was the coach at Pulaski Academy in Arkansas last year. I'm having technical issues with that file. I've been ripping my hair out about it over here, but trying to get it out to you. And as soon as I can figure it out, I will. Unfortunately, not a tech expert on all this stuff. I could put together a lot of things, but sometimes I get tripped up on a thing here or there, and I'm working through it. So still working to get that out. I plan to at some point. Don't make me promise a deadline again, because I don't want to miss another. So I will post it on the Read and Reaction channel at some point here, that interview with Kevin Kelly. So hopefully we got a lot of great content content for you this week of the Georgia game coming up. Certainly thinking about it every single day. It's getting closer. This is the game we live for year round here if you're a Florida Gators fan. So not writing off the Gators this year, not writing them off. They certainly, I know we've been frustrated about some things, but Georgia hasn't seen this type of offense. So I'm the type of fan, I like to go in with a positive outlook into the game. Hey, look, I could sit here and be negative all day about the defense and talk about how they're look otherworldly and Georgia's got an NFL front and blah, 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 blah. But we have all week to get into that, so I won't bore you with that tonight on this episode. I will have a preview. We'll have more previews for you out as the week comes for the Florida moves along down the line for the Florida-Georgia game. But thank you again for joining the Read and Reaction podcast. I'm your host, Nick Knudsen. Stay tuned to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel throughout the week for more Florida Gators football content.